we were discussing the difference between how one shall attack to the 4 openings and how one shall break the 4 openings, which are both lessons in the Zornhau. The first lesson is how one shall attack the 4 openings. The example we're given is as follows. Tristan attacks me with an Oberhau. I counter with a Zornhau Ort. He parries to the side. As soon as the blades clash together, I wind to my right and attack his upper left opening, where he is open. He closes this opening, so I move to the next opening, his lower left. He closes this opening, so I go to the next opening on his lower right. He closes that, so I stay ahead of his sword and attack him where he's open on his upper right. So I stay ahead of his sword and attack to the openings before he closes them. This contrasts with how one shall break the 4 openings, which is as follows. If he attacks to my head with an Oberhau, I cut strongly back at his head with a Zornhau. This will make him parry. If he parries on the weak or on the strong of my sword with the strong of his sword, then I can use the Dupleren, which attacks behind his sword, thus breaking the opening, because this opening was obviously closed by his sword, so I'm going around it and breaking through it and hitting him where he was previously not open. So if we do that again. Alright, so that's if he binds strong on strong. Likewise, if he binds with his weak on my strong, same situation, he cuts at me, I cut strongly back at him, he aborts, parries with his weak on my strong, then I use my leverage against him and stab to his lower opening on his right side with Mutieren, which is breaking his opening on this side, transmuting from above to below on the other side of his sword. So I think that's it.
All right, so we're going to talk about the crump to the flats. There's been a lot of discussion recently about what this means and how it's done. So we're just going to explain it from a few different directions.
All right. So the verse in question is crump to the flats of the masters if you wish to weaken them. A few key words in this are, well, first to the flat of the masters. So you have to strike to the flat of the sword with crump out. Another is the word masters itself. So the theory is that you use the crump out to bind on the flat of the opponent's sword if he's skilled with the sword. You wouldn't want to use a technique like a long Zornort, because if the opponent is skilled with the sword, he would be good at centering his body, and thus the long Zornort wouldn't be very effective against a fighter like that. So if you use the crump out to the flat, you are suppressing his sword and thus immediately winning the bind, and you don't have to deal with worrying about centering and all that stuff. You could use winding techniques against you, things like that. So
okay, so that's kind of talking about the description of the technique itself. It says crump to the flat. Now, coming from a slightly different perspective of why the flat as opposed to any other part of the sword or any other engagement of the sword. And my theories of this have less to do with the source material and more to do with physics and body mechanics. So regardless of your version, your personal versions of the crump out, we can all agree that this is an object that's moving in an arc. Okay, so anytime you have something that's accelerating in an arc, you have to take into account where the axis of rotation is. So having said that, whatever the version of the crump out, I'm going to do crump out from Hamtag. Essentially, axis of rotation is occurring here-ish. We're leaving out the subtleties of hip rotation, all that. Okay, we're just talking about the sword motion. So, just considering that, obviously, the strong is moving slower, as it normally does. The weak is moving much faster. So, the first thing we have to consider is, again, we're trying to deviate the other person's strike. Okay, we're trying to get their Oberhau away from being inside of my body. I can do so a lot more effectively, not only because I have more velocity striking here, but also it's moving on a wider path, which means that I can deviate the sword further away from being inside my body. Okay, we can do this in isolation, so strike him and pull here. Alright, so if I if I engage with the crump bow here, there's also a timing issue. We'll come back to that. It should be self-evident. Okay? I'm going to be performing crump bow here. Okay? With the strong, okay, I have plenty of leverage, but what I don't have is velocity or that ability to deviate the sword very much. Okay? If anything, it might just still strike me further down on my arm. Okay? Also, you'll notice where am I hitting the other person's sword is not on the flat, but it's on their short edge. If we do it sooner, this is where it gets into the timing issue. You want to do this as soon as possible. Not only am I engaging the sword further up, closer to the faster moving portion of the blade, but I'm just cut and pause. I'm striking to the flat here. So I get not only a technique that matches the description in the effect book, but the way it works, well, it's just simply much more effective because I can both blast the sword out of the way due to the velocity, and also the deviation is much wider than it would normally be otherwise. Anything else? Sounds good to me. So that's crump to the flats.
All right. We've been talking a lot about the crump bow, and specifically about the part in the zettel that says, "Crump who leads you astray, the noble war confuses him." So this passage was confusing for a long time because it seemed, this is in pseudo Peter von Danzig, it seemed to talk about how to counter the counter to the crump, because it says something along the lines of, when you hew with the crump bow, you must all the while be open with your left side. And then goes into this play that we thought we interpreted like so. If Tristan hews at me from above, and I cut against his sword, then he cuts to my left side. Sorry, it's over here. Yeah, I'm open on my left side. See, it doesn't make sense. Then I can counter his counter to my crump with the noble war. This is not what the passage says. Upon reading it many, many times, there seems to be a shift in the text, which we'll explain shortly. But what we think it is saying is, there's a preface, which is, when you hew with the crump bow, you are all the while open with your left side, meaning that all the other hews close off your left opening. The crump bow does not. It does not cross the center line. You are open on your left side the entire time that you're hewing the crump bow. So that is where you're open. That is the weakness of the crump bow. You can be attacked there. So now, what the text says is, now that I've given you the weakness to the crump bow, if someone uses the crump bow against you, this is how you exploit it. So if I cut at Tristan, and he uses the crump bow against my sword, and then hews from the sword to my opening, I follow after his sword and wind, and then stab him to his upper left opening, where he is open. So this is the von Danzig version of the counter to the crump. Do you want to talk perspective change, or is it?
That was your...
Okay, so the perspective change is, the first part is giving the preface, which is, the crump bow opens you on the left side. The text then says, if he is thus clever, meaning if the opponent does what I just talked about, which is using the crump bow and being open on the left side, this is how you defeat it. So this perspective change is evident in the text. It was very, very easy to miss. We missed it for a long time, but we think this interpretation is what it's speaking of. I guess we're not going to go to the Ringeck yet. Do you want to add anything to it?
No.
Okay. Okay, this next part is talking about how to counter the crump bow in the Ringeck treatise. So what that says is, do you want to do this? I'll do over. Okay. So if he Oberhaus, and I bind on his sword, he holds strongly against me and thrusts in his point to my chest. Okay? So this is how to counter just the crump bow, whereas in Danzig we were countering the crump bow to the blade and then hew to the head, which follow after it is like this. So two different counters to do two different stages of the same technique. Ringeck goes on to further say, if we have the same bind, and he shoots the point in towards my chest, and I sword with the crump, driving his sword to the earth. He winds up to his right side and puts his point in on my chest, which enters into the noble war. If I parry him to the side, he keeps attacking my openings until he finally gets in again on this side. So, return.
One other thing that I want to mention, and some of my students have already heard this, is that there seems to be at least theoretical connection between how Ringeck handles Krumpel and how Danzig does. So in Ringeck, as we just explained, it kind of benefits the person doing the Oberhau, either because there is no further counter, I stay strong, all I need to do is shift and stab to the chest. The follow-up, as we just explained, basically is an exploitation of a bad parry. Okay, rather than threatening me, Cory is just allowing my tip down to the earth. Okay, so this is very clearly a bad parry. As you saw, I'm just basically pulling his token of some variety. So getting back to Danzig, Danzig offers two follow-ups after the Krumpel. I've already demonstrated one, which is, of course, short edge to the head, given that opportunity to do so. The other, there's no real context for this, but the other counter to it is the winding. And I believe that the reason for the winding is simply a better counter, essentially. It's a good parry that doesn't necessarily have an exploit. And it also, of course, locks off what Ringeck's telling you to do, which is this. So again, there's not a lot of solid evidence for that. It's a pet theory that they are kind of feeding off one another. Is there anything additional? No. Sounds good. It's more casual.
It's going.
Oh, it is? It's filming? Cut that part out.
That part was great.
You're in charge of editing.
Okay.